The snow was falling lightly on the village when the comments began. It was a gray autumn afternoon, and the house on the edge of the community displayed something no one could understand: a second roof. It wasn't an aesthetic renovation, nor an extension. It was a strange structure, suspended above the original roof, steeply inclined, separated by a gap of cold air. Neighbors stopped in the street, pointed, laughed. Some joked about paranoia. Others said she'd gone mad after being alone for so long. The young woman who lived there didn't respond. She just kept working, adjusting the last supports, checking angles, testing the firmness of the pillars. The ridicule was audible, but she knew it was temporary. Winter wouldn't be. The community leader passed by the house one morning, observed the construction with a critical eye, and commented aloud that unnecessary modifications only generated waste. He said that traditional roofs had always worked, that the recent snowstorms were nothing more than media exaggeration, that it was unfounded fear. The woman listened in silence, her fingers stained with grease and rust. She didn't argue. She didn't try to convince him. She simply nodded slightly and went back to work. She knew that words wouldn't change anything. Time would change. Winter would change. And when the snow began to weigh heavily, it would be too late for those who hadn't prepared. She wasn't seeking approval. She was seeking survival. The mountain community lived under the echo of a false sense of security. The houses were old, built for winters that no longer existed, but no one wanted to admit it. No one wanted to accept that the weather was different, that the snowstorms were heavier, longer, more dangerous. The young woman had tried to warn them. Years ago, after observing snow accumulation patterns, temperature records, and signs from nature, she had expressed concern. She was treated as an alarmist, as an exaggerator. As strange, since then, she had learned to be quiet. She had learned that silent preparation was worth more than an ignored word. And now, as she raised that second roof, she knew that scorn was inevitable. But I also knew that the storm would come, and when it came, it wouldn't ask permission. The house was on the edge of the village, where the dirt road ended and the pine forest began. It was a simple construction, made of dark wood with small windows, sheltered from the north wind by a natural row of rocks. The air there always seemed colder, sharper, heavy with the damp smell of moss and resin. During the winter, the snow accumulated first in that region, forming white mounds that swallowed fences and gates. The woman had chosen that place precisely for that reason, not for comfort, but for exposure. There she saw winter arrive before everyone else. I felt the change in temperature days before the rest of the community. I observed the behavior of the animals, the movement of the clouds, the texture of the air. That geographical isolation was, in fact, an observation post. And she had learned to read the signs that others ignored. Inside the house, the rooms were organized with functional precision. Shelves overflowing with homemade preserves, piles of dry firewood stacked near the stove, woolen blankets neatly folded. Nothing was decorative. Everything had a purpose. The wooden table was covered in notes, handwritten charts, temperature records from the last 5 years, drawings of roof angles, weight load calculations. She spent entire nights studying prevailing winds, testing materials, reviewing every detail of the construction. The light from the oil lamp flickered on the papers while the night's chill pressed against the windows. Outside, the village slept peacefully, believing that winter would be as it always had been. But there, in that remote house, the preparations never stopped. Each number noted was a prediction, each calculation an attempt to survive what was to come. The young woman's social condition was one of gentle invisibility. She held no position of prestige, did not participate in community meetings, and was not invited to celebrations. Her name was known, but her voice was not. When she went to the market, the greetings were brief, polite, empty. Conversations died when she approached. Not out of declared hostility, but out of discomfort. She represented something the village preferred not to face, the possibility that they were wrong, that the world had changed, that the security they felt was illusory. So it was easier to treat her as eccentric, as someone who lived too isolated, thought too much, feared too much. Her solitude was not merely physical, it was social, emotional, built layer by layer over the years. This distance had begun subtly. Years ago, during a community meeting about road repairs, she had mentioned concerns about the roofs. She said that the winters were getting harsher, that the snow accumulated differently, that old structures might not hold up. There was an awkward silence, then discreet laughter. Someone commented that she was exaggerating, that the roofs had always held up and always would. Another said she watched too much news. The meeting continued without taking her words seriously. Since then, she had learned that warning was useless, that collective consensus was stronger than individual evidence, that people only believed in the danger when it was already upon them. So she stopped talking, and she began to act on her own. The isolation deepened over time. She would go days without speaking to anyone. Her interactions were limited to the essentials, buying groceries, exchanging tools, paying bills. There were no close friends, no confidants. The emotional wound was always there, discreet but present. The feeling of being treated as an alarmist, as hysterical, as paranoid, of having her concerns ridiculed, of being seen as a problem, not as a warning. But she had learned to live with it. She had transformed solitude into a method, silence into a strategy. And now, as she built that second roof under the judgmental gaze of the community, she knew the isolation would continue, at least until the snow really started to fall, until the weight became unbearable, until ridicule turned into despair, and then perhaps someone would finally listen. The decision to build the second roof wasn't impulsive. It was the result of months observing how snow behaved on the village houses. The woman had noticed that the problem wasn't just the amount of snow falling, but the uneven weight that accumulated. The wet snow compacted in layers, froze overnight, partially melted during the day, and then froze again. This cycle created dense, heavy slabs that pressed against the structures. She saw cracks and beams, arched roofs, gutters torn off. But no one else paid attention. Everyone treated it as natural wear and tear, an inevitable part of winter. So she decided to act. Not for others, but for herself. She would build a second roof, steeper and smoother, separated from the original by an air gap. The snow wouldn't accumulate. It would slide off before gaining deadly weight. It was simple, logical, efficient. But to an outsider, it seemed like madness. As the first beams of the second roof began to rise, comments spread quickly. Neighbors stopped on the road just to watch. Some asked questions, feigning curiosity, but the tone was mocking. One man asked if she was building a barn in the air. Another commented that it looked like a waste of good wood. An older woman shook her head and said that loneliness did strange things to people's minds. No one really asked why. No one wanted to understand the logic. They just looked, judged, laughed. The young woman continued working in silence, going up and down the ladder, adjusting angles, fixing beams. Sweat poured down even in the cold. Her hands became rough, calloused. But she didn't stop. Every joke she heard was fuel, every look of disdain, confirmation that she was alone in this. The community leader reappeared, this time accompanied by 2 other residents. They said they had received complaints about the strange modification to her house, that it detracted from the village's aesthetics, that it looked like an improvised, even dangerous structure. He suggested she reconsider, that the traditional roofs had always worked perfectly, that there was no reason for alarm. He mentioned that recent winters were normal, that the media exaggerated, that unfounded fear helped no one. The woman listened to everything without interrupting. When he finished, she simply said that the construction was within her property, that it didn't violate any rules, and that she would continue. The leader frowned, disappointed. He said she was making a mistake, that she was wasting resources, that she would regret it. Then he left, and she went back to work. The community's negative reaction wasn't just verbal, it was social, silent, effective. When she entered the market, conversations stopped, eyes averted. No one was openly hostile, but the coldness was palpable. People treated her as someone who had crossed an invisible line, someone who challenged the consensus, who questioned collective safety, who insisted on seeing danger where everyone saw normality. Some neighbors began to avoid her completely. Others made indirect comments, always within earshot. They said it was sad to see someone so young consumed by fear, that paranoia was a silent disease, that she should go out more, socialize, trust. But the woman knew that this wasn't about trust. It was about denial, and denial, however comfortable it might be, wouldn't prevent a roof from collapsing. The perceived risk of her decision was clear to everyone. A waste of time, money, and effort on something unnecessary. For the community, the second roof was a symbol of excess, of irrational fear, of an inability to live in peace. It represented distrust in what had always worked. And that bothered them, because if she was right, everyone else would be wrong. And no one wanted to admit that possibility. So it was easier to laugh, safer to ridicule, more comfortable to treat her as eccentric than to face the idea that perhaps, just perhaps, the world had changed and they hadn't noticed. The woman understood this. She didn't blame them, but she also wouldn't expect them to wake up in time. When the snow really started to weigh heavily, she would be ready, and they wouldn't. The construction of the second roof required meticulous planning. The woman began by studying the angle of inclination. She tested different degrees using wooden models and compacted snow. She discovered that angles above 45 degrees allowed for natural sliding, even with wet snow. She chose 50 degrees to ensure a safety margin. Then came the question of the surface material. Common wood retained moisture and created friction. She needed something smooth and waterproof. She found old metal sheets in an abandoned building materials depot. She cleaned each piece, removed rust, and applied a protective coating. The metal would reflect some of the solar heat during the day, further hindering accumulation. Every detail had a purpose. Nothing was decorative. Nothing was superfluous. The preparation was silent, but absolutely intentional. The space between the two roofs was precisely calculated. She determined that 60 centimeters would be sufficient to allow for the circulation of cool air, but not so wide as to weaken the upper structure. This gap would create a layer of natural thermal insulation. The circulating cool air would prevent the house's internal heat from melting the snow accumulated on the upper roof, preventing freezing. She installed small side vents to ensure a constant flow of air. Nothing blocked, nothing sealed. The air needed to move. This specific choice was crucial. Without the air gap, the second roof would be useless. With it, it became a complete protection system. The woman tested the airflow using incense smoke on cold days. She observed the movement, adjusted the vents, and ensured everything worked as planned. The supporting pillars were strategically positioned away from the main walls of the house. She didn't want the additional weight of the structure to directly press against the old foundation. Each pillar was fixed to a reinforced concrete base, buried beyond the soil frost line. She used treated wood beams, resistant to moisture and extreme cold. She reinforced the joints with metal supports. She tested the firmness of each support point before proceeding. The structure needed to be solid, but also flexible enough to withstand strong winds without cracking. This balance between rigidity and elasticity required constant adjustments. She spent hours tightening screws, measuring tensions, checking alignments. The work was exhausting, but necessary. Each well-positioned pillar was a guarantee that the upper roof would not collapse onto the original one. The decision not to install gutters on the upper roof was deliberate. Gutters retained melted snow that refroze overnight, forming heavy blocks of ice. Without gutters, the water would run directly over the edges and fall away from the house walls. The woman planned the slope of the edges to direct the flow to safe areas, away from the foundation. She dug small channels in the ground around the house to drain the meltwater. She covered these channels with loose stones that wouldn't freeze into a solid block. Each element worked together. The roof slid the snow. The edges directed the water. The channels drained the excess. Nothing accumulated. Nothing created deadly weight. The system was simple, but complete, and it would work because each piece had been designed to work in conjunction with the others. For weeks, the woman worked alone. She would wake before dawn when the air was still cold and the village slept silently. She climbed the structure with heavy tools on her back, her hands protected by thick gloves. The metal of the sheets burned with cold to the touch. The wind cut her face. But she continued. She carefully fastened each metal sheet, ensuring that the joints were perfect so as not to create points of friction. She used high-quality rivets and screws, resistant to corrosion. She tested their firmness by hitting them with her closed fist. The sound echoed dry, solid. The structure was taking shape. And while she worked, she heard the comments of the neighbors passing by. Laughter, jokes, disbelief. But none of that mattered. Winter wouldn't ask for her opinion. Winter would simply come. The final stage of construction involved fine-tuning. The woman checked every joint, every support point, every angle of inclination. She climbed onto the upper roof and walked across the metal surface, testing its strength. The metal was firm, yet flexible. She slid a block of ice across the surface. It slid down quickly, without obstruction. Perfect. Then she tested the air gap. She lit a candle inside the space between the roofs and observed the flame. It flickered slightly, indicating air circulation. Everything was working as planned. She climbed down from the structure, tired but satisfied. Her body ached. Her hands were marked with cuts and calluses, but the work was complete. The second roof was finished. Now all that remained was to wait. To wait for Winter to show whether she was right or crazy. In the following days, the woman meticulously organized the interior of the house. She stacked enough firewood for 3 months. She stockpiled water in jugs. She checked canned goods, blankets, and a lamp. She prepared a first aid kit. She reinforced the seals on windows and doors. Everything that could be anticipated was. She didn't just expect to survive the winter. She hoped not to have to leave the house for weeks if necessary. She knew that when the snow really started to accumulate, leaving might be impossible. And if others hadn't prepared, she wouldn't be able to help those who were far away. So she ensured her own safety first. Only after that could she think about offering shelter, if someone needed it, if someone finally believed the danger was real. The last thing she did was plant visual markers around the house. Tall stakes with red fabric tied to the top. If snow covered doors and windows, those stakes would still be visible, marking the exact location of the house. She buried the stakes deep, well beyond the depth she expected for accumulated snow. She tested the firmness of each one. She shook, pulled, pushed. They all remained solid. This detail might seem excessive, but she knew that under dense snow, even familiar structures disappeared. The stakes would ensure that, even under severe storms, the house would not become invisible. And if someone needed to find it, they could, even in the midst of the white chaos, even when everything else was buried. The preparation was complete. Now Winter would decide who was right. Winter arrived looking the same as always. The first snowfalls fell lightly, forming thin layers on rooftops and streets. Children played in the freshly fallen snow, building snowmen and fortresses. Adults cleared the entrances of their houses with shovels, commenting that winter was as expected. Nothing seemed different, nothing seemed threatening. The young woman watched from her window, attentive to details that others didn't see. The texture of the snow was different, wetter, denser. The sky had a persistent grayish hue, without clear openings. The wind blew from an unusual direction, small signs that, in isolation, meant nothing. But together they formed a worrying pattern. She wrote everything down in her notebook: date, temperature, wind direction, type of precipitation. The neighbors continued their normal routines, and she continued observing. In the house next door, a man climbed onto the roof to clear the accumulated snow. He commented aloud that there wasn't much to remove, that it was an exaggeration to have climbed up. He laughed at his own concern. The woman saw the layer of snow on his roof. It seemed thin, harmless. But she noticed something he hadn't. The snow wasn't uniform. It accumulated more on one side, creating uneven weight, and the base near the tiles was already beginning to compact. This meant that the snow was melting slightly during the day and refreezing at night, forming dense layers. She knew that this process would only worsen, but she said nothing. He had already tried to warn her before. She had already been ignored, so you just watched and waited. A few days later, the temperature dropped abruptly. The thermometer on her porch read 10 degrees below zero. The snow that had recently fallen had frozen solid. The streets were covered in ice. Some people slipped as they left their houses. The market was quiet. The village was beginning to feel the real cold, but still treated it as a normal winter. The woman noticed that the snow on her own upper roof had begun to slide. Small white blocks slid down the sloping metal surface and fell to the ground away from the walls. The system was working exactly as planned. Meanwhile, on neighboring roofs, the snow remained still, slowly compacting. The contrast was visible, but no one paid attention. Yet. The power went out for the first time on a windy night. Only a few houses were affected, including 2 on the young woman's street. Families lit candles in fireplaces, treating the problem as a temporary inconvenience. But she knew it was a sign. The power grid was under strain. Heavy snow branches began to fall onto wires. Old poles swayed in the wind. The village's infrastructure hadn't been designed for such harsh winters. She checked her own reserves of oil lamps, batteries, and candles. Everything was in order. She didn't depend on external power. She could go weeks without electricity if necessary. But she knew that most of her neighbors weren't so prepared. And when the power really went out, panic would begin. On the 5th day of intense cold, the first door jammed. A family 3 houses down tried to leave in the morning and discovered that their door was stuck. The snow accumulated at the entrance, compacted by its own weight, had formed a solid barrier. They spent almost an hour breaking the ice with improvised tools before they managed to open it. The news spread quickly. Some people began cleaning their entrances more frequently. Others installed temporary coverings, but they still treated it as an isolated problem, not as a symptom of something bigger. The young woman cleaned her own entrance daily, but the snow that fell from the upper roof never accumulated near the door. The system's design ensured that the snow slid to distant areas. Another detail that went unnoticed, another choice that made a difference. And winter was only beginning to show its claws. The snow began to fall continuously. It was no longer sporadic snowfall, but a constant precipitation that lasted for days without stopping. The sky remained overcast, gray, oppressive. The white layer on the village rooftops visibly thickened each morning. What had been a few centimeters had become half a meter, then a meter. The weight was beginning to take its toll. Old beams creaked during the night, dry, sharp sounds that woke the families. Some people climbed onto the roofs to try to clear the snow, but the work was exhausting and dangerous. The surface was slippery, the cold biting, and the snow continued to fall. For every square meter cleared, 2 new ones were covered. It was a losing battle. The young woman watched from her window. Her upper roof remained almost clear. The steep slope and metallic surface caused the snow to slide continuously. Huge mounds formed around the house, but none on the structure itself. Temperatures plummeted even further. The thermometer read 15 degrees below zero at night. The snow that fell was dry, fine, but in absurd quantities. The wind blew strongly, creating white swirls that obscured vision. Leaving home had become risky. Some families began to run out of supplies. The market opened for only a few hours, only when the weather permitted. The roads connecting the village to nearby towns were impassable. No one could enter, no one could leave. The isolation was complete. The electricity failed with increasing frequency. Some houses were without power for days. The cold inside the homes intensified. Fireplaces worked at their limit, consuming firewood rapidly. And the snow continued to fall. The feeling of normalcy was beginning to crack, replaced by a silent unease that grew stronger each day. The first roof partially collapsed on a freezing morning. It was an old house in the lower part of the village, a wooden structure over 50 years old. The weight of the accumulated snow had bent the central beams to the point of rupture. A loud crack was heard, followed by a prolonged creak. Part of the roof sank inward, creating a dangerous depression. The family managed to escape in time, but the house was compromised. Snow continued to fall on the damaged area, worsening the problem. The news spread quickly. People came out of their homes to see the damage, their faces marked by genuine concern for the first time. Some began to question whether their own roofs would hold. The community leader organized an emergency meeting. They discussed solutions, but none seemed viable. Clearing the roofs was dangerous. Reinforcing structures required materials they didn't have, and the snow showed no sign of stopping. 2 days later, another roof gave way. This time it was a complete collapse. The structure couldn't support the weight and collapsed during the early morning hours, the crash waking half the village. The family was asleep and had seconds to escape. They managed to get out through the back, but lost everything. The house was destroyed, covered in snow and rubble. Fear completely replaced the mockery. No one laughed anymore. No one pretended everything was all right anymore. People began to look at their own roofs with real terror. Cracks previously ignored became a source of panic. Every nighttime creak caused insomnia. Some families began sleeping on the ground floor, ready to flee if necessary. The entire village lived under constant tension. And throughout all this, the house on the edge of the community remained intact. The second roof continued to serve its purpose. The snow slid off, the weight didn't accumulate, and slowly, some were beginning to notice. Doors began to jam in several houses simultaneously. The snow piled up at the entrances, reaching a height that made it impossible to open them without brutal effort. Families were trapped inside their own homes, unable to go out to fetch water or firewood. Some tried to escape through the windows, but the snow was too high. Cries for help echoed through the village. Neighbors tried to help each other, digging makeshift tunnels to the jammed doors. The work was exhausting. Hands froze even with gloves. Sweat chilled their bodies. And for every door opened, 2 more were blocked the following morning. The situation was spiraling out of control. The village, which had always coped well with winter, now found itself paralyzed, trapped, threatened by an element it had previously thought it understood. Collective trust was crumbling, and the worst was yet to come. The historic storm was heralded by a sudden change in the wind. It was now blowing in violent gusts, carrying snow in dense swirls that obscured any visibility. The sky darkened even further, almost black despite it being midday. The temperature dropped to 20 degrees below zero. The falling snow was so intense that it formed an impenetrable white curtain. The sound of the wind was deafening, a constant howl that penetrated walls and windows. Some roof tiles began to come loose, torn away by the force of the wind. Windows trembled in their frames. The electricity failed completely throughout the village. The darkness was broken only by oil lamps and candles. People gathered in the center of their houses, away from windows and exterior walls, embracing each other to keep warm. The fear was palpable. Everyone knew that this was different. This was not an ordinary winter. It was something they had never faced before. During the storm, more roofs began to collapse. The sound of cracking wood echoed through the village even amidst the roar of the wind. Structures that had withstood decades finally succumbed. Families ran from their homes, sinking waist-deep in snow, desperate to find safe shelter. Some knocked on neighbors' doors, but many were already dealing with their own problems. Chaos had taken hold. And it was at that moment, at the height of despair, that eyes began to turn to the house on the edge of the village. The house with the strange roof. The house of the woman everyone had ridiculed, because even under a brutal storm, even with unimaginable amounts of snow falling, that second roof continued to function. The snow slid, the structure remained solid, and for the first time, what had previously seemed like madness began to look like salvation. Someone noticed the red stakes. Even under the snow that covered almost everything, those red cloths tied to the top of the stakes were still visible, clearly marking the location of the house. It was perfect signage, exactly what was needed amidst the white chaos. A man pointed to the stakes and shouted something that the wind carried away. But others understood. They began to move in that direction, sinking into the snow, fighting the wind, desperate. The house they had previously avoided, that they had previously judged, was now a beacon. And the woman they had previously ridiculed now represented the only real chance of survival. The collective pride, so strong for so long, was finally breaking. Not by choice, but out of absolute necessity. Because when death becomes a real possibility, mockery is no longer useful. If you've been following stories like this, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. This helps us continue bringing you accounts that show that preparation, even when ridiculed, can make all the difference. The first knock on the door came during the worst part of the storm. It was a hesitant knock, almost inaudible over the roar of the wind. The young woman was near the fireplace, checking the firewood stock, when she heard it. She walked to the entrance, opened the door, and found a family of 3. They were covered in snow, shivering violently, their faces marked by cuts from the wind-blown ice. The man began to speak, but the words came out jumbled, a mixture of apology and pleading. He said that the roof of their house had collapsed, that they had nowhere to go, that they were desperate. The woman did not hesitate. She did not demand explanations. She did not demand satisfaction. She simply made way and let them in. She led them to the fireplace, brought blankets, and prepared hot tea. The warmth of the house contrasted brutally with the deadly cold outside. The family wept, a mixture of relief and shame, and she simply cared for them silently and efficiently. Minutes later, more knocks. Another family. Then 2 more. In the space of an hour, 8 people were sheltered in the house. They all came from homes that had collapsed or were under imminent threat. They all had the same expression: fear, exhaustion, and profound embarrassment. Because they knew they had laughed at that woman, that they had treated her as paranoid, that they had ignored her warnings. And now they were there, depending on exactly what they had ridiculed. The young woman organized the space. She distributed blankets, rationed supplies, established shifts to keep the fireplace lit. She said nothing about the past. She didn't mention the jokes. She didn't demand recognition. She simply did what was necessary. Because at that moment, pride didn't save lives. Preparation did. And she had prepared herself precisely for that. The community leader was one of the last to arrive. He knocked forcefully on the door, his face red with cold and humiliation. When the woman opened it, he stood there for seconds, unable to speak. Finally, he murmured an almost inaudible apology. He said he was wrong, that he should have listened, that the whole community should have listened. His voice broke on the last sentence. The woman simply nodded for him to come in. There was no time for formal apologies. There was no room for wounded pride. There was only the immediate need for survival. The leader went inside, joined the others near the fireplace, and for the first time since the construction of the second roof had begun, someone asked how it worked. She explained, without arrogance, without resentment. She simply shared the knowledge that no one had wanted to hear before. During the night, while the storm raged outside, something changed inside that house. People began to talk. Not about the weather or the danger, but about the woman, about how she had foreseen everything, about how every detail he had built now made sense. The second roof wasn't madness. It was precise engineering. The air gap wasn't wasteful. It was thermal insulation. The metal surface wasn't excessive. It was an efficient solution. The red stakes weren't paranoia. They were literal salvation. Everything that had seemed absurd before proved absolutely essential. And slowly, shamefully, the community began to recognize that it had ignored not a madwoman, but someone who simply saw further ahead. Someone who had prepared while others relied on luck and tradition. And now, that preparation kept them all alive. The storm reached its peak in the early morning. The wind howled so hard it made the walls tremble. The snow fell so thickly it seemed solid, completely blocking any visibility. Inside the house, people stayed awake, unable to sleep under the deafening noise. The fireplace crackled, providing precious warmth while the cold outside became deadly. Suddenly, a distant rumble cut through even the sound of the wind. Then another, and another, roofs collapsing. The woman knew what that sound was. Everyone knew. More houses were giving way under the unbearable weight. More families were losing their homes. She looked out the window, but saw only impenetrable white. There was no way to know how many structures had fallen. There was no way to help those still outside. All they could do was wait, and hope that those who needed shelter would find the red stakes that marked their homes. Around 3 a.m, desperate knocks echoed at the door. These weren't hesitant knocks like before. It was a violent, urgent, terrified pounding. The woman rushed to open it. Outside, 5 people nearly collapsed inside. They were covered in snow from head to toe, their lips blue, their bodies trembling uncontrollably. A child cried, the sound muffled by the cold that paralyzed their muscles. An elderly man could barely stand, supported by 2 adults. They all came from houses that had completely collapsed. They had escaped by seconds, literally crawling through the snow to find safety. The woman acted quickly. She removed their wet clothes, wrapped everyone in dry blankets, and placed them near the fireplace. She made more hot tea, forcing everyone to drink, even though they were too shivering to hold their mugs. The house was packed now, almost 15 people in a space designed for one, but everyone was alive, and that was what mattered. The space became cramped. People sat shoulder to shoulder, sharing the blankets, vying for warmth. There was no privacy, no comfort, but there was safety. The house's structure remained absolutely solid. The second roof continued to function perfectly. With each gust of wind, they heard the sound of snow sliding across the metal surface, falling away from the walls. The system was under extreme testing, facing exactly the scenario for which it had been designed. And it held up. Every detail planned months ago was now paying off completely. The pillars set back from the main walls prevented overloading the foundation. The air gap kept the thermal insulation working. The steep slope prevented dangerous accumulation. The absence of gutters prevented the formation of ice blocks. Everything worked together exactly as planned, and everyone inside that house witnessed the difference between real preparation and blind faith in old methods. During the storm's most intense hours, the woman circulated among the people, checking for signs of hypothermia, distributing water, keeping morale high. It wasn't a role she had sought. It wasn't a position she had desired. But it was what the situation demanded, and she fulfilled it without complaint. An older woman, who weeks earlier had commented on loneliness doing strange things with one's mind, now held her hand and apologized. She said she was ashamed, that she should have listened, that collective stubbornness had almost cost lives. The young woman simply squeezed her hand back and said that the important thing was that everyone was safe. There was no room for resentment. There was no time for bitterness. There was only the immediate, urgent present which demanded total focus. The past could be dealt with later, if there was a later. For now, simply surviving was already a victory. As dawn broke, the storm began to lose strength. The wind gradually subsided. The snow continued to fall, but less intensely. The gray light of day revealed a devastating scene through the windows. The village was unrecognizable. Enormous mounds of snow covered everything. Several houses had completely collapsed, reduced to white-covered rubble. Others had sunken roofs, cracked walls, compromised structures. Trees had fallen, posts were bent. It was destruction on a scale no one had imagined possible. But the house on the edge of the village remained intact. Red stakes still marked its position, visible above the snow. The second roof was clean, the metallic surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. Around it, mounds of snow accumulated at a safe distance, exactly where the design had directed. The difference was brutal and absolutely undeniable. People began to slowly emerge from the house, assessing the damage. They walked through chest-deep snow, battling extreme exhaustion. Some wept at the sight of their own destroyed homes. Others remained in shocked silence, unable to process the extent of the devastation. But all, without exception, looked back at the house that had sheltered them. At the second roof they had previously ridiculed, and they understood, finally, that the difference between life and death lay in choices made months before, in preparation that no one wanted to value, in warnings that no one wanted to heed. The woman watched from her balcony, tired but relieved. She felt no satisfaction at the reversal, no pleasure at being right. She only felt profound gratitude for having managed to save lives, for having transformed ridicule into rescue, for having proven that preparation, even when discredited, was always worthwhile. Sometimes we need to follow stories to the end to understand that true strength lies in silent persistence. If this story touched you in any way, consider following the channel. Each follower motivates us to continue sharing stories that show how determination, even alone, can make all the difference. Winter finally receded 2 weeks later. The snow stopped falling, temperatures slowly rose, and the sky cleared for the first time in over a month. The village began the long process of reconstruction. Of the 43 houses in the community, 17 had suffered total or partial collapses. Another 20 had serious structural damage. Only 6 remained intact. And among them, the young woman's house was the only one that hadn't even suffered cracks. The difference was obvious, impossible to ignore. The families who lost their homes found temporary shelter with neighbors or in makeshift community buildings. But everyone knew that something needed to change. The village couldn't face another winter with the same old structures. And the solution was there, visible, tested under extreme pressure: the second roof. The transformation in how the community treated the young woman was complete. She didn't become a celebrated heroine with parties or tributes. There were no public speeches extolling her wisdom. But there was a profound and silent change. When she walked through the streets covered in melting snow, people greeted her with genuine respect. They stopped to ask about construction techniques, materials, and slope calculations. Some asked permission to visit her house, to study the second roof up close, to understand every detail. She received everyone, explained patiently, and shared knowledge without charging anything. The social isolation that had marked her life for years began to unravel, not because she had changed, but because others finally saw what had always been there: meticulous preparation, careful observation, and the courage to act even under total disbelief. That woman they had previously avoided was now a silent reference point, a foundation upon which they would rebuild not only houses, but mentalities. The practical legacy spread rapidly. During the spring, 6 houses were rebuilt following the second roof principle. Another 12 adapted their existing structures, installing pitched upper roofs and creating air gaps. The now humbled community leader organized construction workshops where the young woman taught techniques she had developed. She showed slope calculations, explained the importance of airflow, demonstrated how to position pillars. People took notes, asked questions, discussed adaptations. The community revised building codes, establishing new standards that took into account not the winter of the past, but the winter they were actually facing now. And at the heart of it all was the belated but essential understanding that ignoring signs, ridiculing preparation, and blindly trusting traditions could cost lives. It cost homes. It almost cost people. That lesson would not be forgotten. Stories like this remind us that sometimes the isolation and persistence of those who prepare silently save not only themselves, but everyone around them.